thing I wanted to bring up, because we talked about this earlier, about it's not where you go, it's the people you meet. And I think now more than ever in the world, travel is so important, to go and to really interact with people and find out that the judgment and things we hear are really just, they're not all true. And you know, in getting ready to talk to you, I know you went to Iran this past fall. And I want to talk about that, but I actually found an article that you wrote in 2015.
Okay.
Why you were going to Burma, Myanmar, right?
Yep.
And I found it to be really interesting because you really talked about, you got an email, I'll explain in a second, but you got an email basically saying, you know, why you should or should not go there. But then you also related to a lot of other places you've been that maybe weren't high on people's lists, such as North Korea or other places where you really said why it's so important to go there.
Yeah.
Right? I want you just to share a little bit about, again, I think it's so important in today's world, about going and experiencing and meeting those people, not just taking the judgment we hear from the media.
Well, I expect that we're talking to the converted here, but sure. Certainly is a very profound school of thought that when a government is ignoring human rights or is in some sort of egregious fashion dealing with its own citizens or the environment and stuff, that the best method is to boycott it. South Africa is probably the best modern example where apartheid required that they cannot be in the Olympics. No travelers should go there. We should try to starve them to death and ignore them and isolate them. Same thing we're doing with North Korea now. Apartheid fell largely because of the porous product of travel. Paul Simon was a great example of that. He was vilified when he decided to go to South Africa and understand their music and produce an album celebrating their music. But that opened up the country and its condition to the world. So the more I think you travel, you are an ambassador and a bridge to understanding to people around the world, no matter how oppressed the society is, no matter what the government is doing. It's the people-to-people connection that ultimately is, I think, the chip in the wall that will bring it down eventually. North Korea is a great example of that. There is this sort of slow seep of information and humanity that's coming in from the borders and from travelers that's slowly changing the minds of people who have been under a propaganda regime for a long time.
And Iran's a good example, and I'm just going to put up, again, I know you were in Iran this past fall, and that's a good example of a lot going on even recently in Iran.
Yes.
You were there, and what was your experience? This is your second or third time there?
It was my second time to Iran. So Iran was very meaningful to me. My father was in the CIA, and he was part of the first class of CIA employees. So they were all recruited by Allen Dulles, the founder of the CIA, who went to Yale, and my father was a graduate student at Yale, and he recruited everybody for the first few years from Yale and his old classmates. My father's first mission was to reinstall the Shah, who in 1953 had been ousted by a democratic election, a guy named Mossadegh, who wanted to nationalize the oil wells that were being exploited by the British, primarily. The British would take 95% of all profits from the oils and spirit it out of the country, and it became critical to the British economy. But Mossadegh nationalized the oil companies, kicked out the British, and Churchill was the prime minister at the time, was going, we're going to collapse as a country, we have to get this oil back. But they banned all the Brits. So Churchill went then to the US. Initially Truman was the president, and he went to Truman and said, look, we need help. We can't go in to Iran anymore, but it's vital to our existence. You need to go in for us. And Truman turned him down. Eisenhower was running for election. Churchill went to Eisenhower and said, we will fund a secret fund for your election if you promise that you will send a group into Iran and orchestrate a coup. And Eisenhower accepted the money, accepted the challenge. The British played the press in the U.S. Brilliantly, very similar to what's going on with the Russians now, but in the analog world. And Eisenhower was elected, true to his word. He sent the first group of CIA people to Iran. They used a film as the cover, which was incredible because it was repeated in 1979 in the film Argo. But the initial one was in '53, and my father was part of this team, and they were successful. They ousted Mogaddesh. The Shah came back in, and the Shah ruled until 1979, and he was a disaster. By '79, the Khomeini decided that he wanted to orchestrate his own coup, kick out the Shah, and turn it into an Islamic state. Anyway, all of this background goes to say that for me to go to, I'd been to Iran in '78 under the Shah. And it was a wild place because the Shah wanted everything to be Western. So there were strip clubs, everybody wore miniskirts back then, and the women had, wild bouffant haircuts, and it was a crazy place. Under Khomeini in '79, a light switch was hit, and it turned into the Islamic Republic that we know today, seeing America, who had interfered so much in their politics, as the enemy. So I'd been in '78. I'm sorry for talking too long.
No,
I went back with a lot of trepidation because my father's involvement is well documented. There have been a number of books about this, and I thought, well, this is kind of a scary moment to come back to Iran with my father's namesake. And there was a moment of immigration when I came in where they pulled me aside, and I thought, oh no, this is it, But I went through, and it was an extraordinary, eye-opening trip. It's a large, beautiful country, very wealthy, the fourth largest oil producer in the world. But because of the boycotts, which still exist, it's created this alternative universe.
Right.
Yeah, where everything you see looks like something you'd see in Europe or in America, but it's different. So Romex watches instead of Rolex or something. But every there are no McDonald's, but there might be a McDougal's or something. So
it's an upside down world.
Yeah, it's an upside down world. It's like bizarre world.
A bizarre world. I was going to ask you about that feeling and trepidation, and I wanted to show this one picture of this. And you
there we are.
This, and you wrote an article about this, and if you could see this, down with the U.S. Did you feel that when you met people there?
No, did not feel that. So.
And was this the only sign you saw like this, or was this?
No, well, there were a number here. This was a day of celebration. There was an 8-year war between Iraq and Iran that took place. Saddam Hussein initiated it immediately after Khomeini took over, because Khomeini was the most evil person in my perception ever to rule a country. So he came in and he executed everybody, thousands and thousands of people that had anything to do with the Shah or his regime, including everybody in the army. And so there was no army to speak of, so Saddam Hussein said, this is my chance. And so he moved in aggressively, and the U.S. backed him. So the U.S. put a lot of money and arms into Saddam Hussein in this effort, because we'd just gone through that hostage crisis for 444 days. And Iran had to quickly sort of assemble a new army and train people and get them going again. This is an annual celebration of the 1 million Iranians who died during that war. And as part of it, there are these lingering sentiments about the U.S. and its involvement in funding Iraq in that particular war. It wasn't our experience, though. Everybody we met was incredibly hospitable, which dials back to the original Persian religion, the Zoroastrianism, which was the first large religion that celebrated both the bipolar, I guess, good and evil entities. And Christianity and Judaism all sort of fanned out from Zoroastrianism.
Again, back to the kind of conversation of going and seeing and experiencing the people there, because you had a brilliant time.
Yes, well, I highly recommend it.
I want to get into your experience as an adventure, traveler and river rafting, right?
Yeah.
So before we do that, I have a lot of questions on that, but let's just show this quick little video that gives a great backstory on Richard's experience.
We were Colorado River runners, barely in our 20s. We called our new enterprise Sobek, after the ancient Egyptian crocodile god. Of all the dangers in Africa, we feared most the crocodiles, and we hoped by naming our venture after their deity, he might look kindly on our passage. Whether it was our name, or our logos, or our crocodile handshake, the magic worked. We survived the crocs. In little more than 2 years, we made the first ascents of several major rivers in Ethiopia. We were the first to descend the Awash, the Baro, the Omo, and the most dangerous part of the Blue Nile. No one had done anything like this before us. God, we had fun. We made plans to run the Grand Canyon of Africa, the Takazé.
Okay, so I pause it here for a second because I want to catch up to where we were, and then I'll talk about the second half of this.
Sure.
All right, so you get introduced to river rafting. I think you went to the CCA, the meeting in DC.
Right, yeah.
And then you worked in Colorado, Stanislaus, and then you hear about this expedition through National Geographic that's going to Ethiopia, right?
Yes.
And you wanted to be on this trip.
Yes.
And what happened?
Well, I was a river guide on the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon, and it was a relatively new activity, and I felt after a few seasons that I had...
What year is this?
This is a long time ago. Long time ago. But I felt like I was one of the more experienced people as a guide on the Colorado River. Geographic had decided to team up with one of the outfitters to go do the first descent of this river called the Omo in Ethiopia. They were building this the river trip of the century, and they were charging $20,000 a person if people wanted to join the Geographic Expedition team. So I went to the outfitter and I said, I want to be on this team. I think I'm more qualified than probably anybody else in the Grand Canyon. Only the Grand Canyon had people who had guiding experience back then on wild rivers. And he said, well, you're too skinny, come back in a few months and let's talk about it then. So I went back to college and I enrolled in a couple of courses and spent all my time buffing up and drinking protein shakes. and I came back all buffed up, like a Robert De Niro type thing, and walked into his door and said, hey, I'm ready, I'm ready to go. And he said, well, I decided to hire my brother instead, so there's no room for you. So this massive expedition in those days was daunting, but I turned to a couple friends and I said, why don't we just do it ourselves? So
you were turned down and you said, screw this, I'm going to get people together and we're going to do this ourselves.
Yep.
Okay, so you guys went and you did the river before that.
Yes, yep. So so we were 6 months before the river trip of the century. So 6 months before that. Yeah.
And that river trip ended up going, and what happened to that, the whole footage and everything with National Geographic?
Well, I mean, I sort of dove into the research on this whole thing, and it was pretty scary. A lot of nightmares came out of all the ways you can die on a river in Africa, from the hippos and crocodiles to snail-borne diseases, schistosomiasis, and the insects and the coyote, the hyenas and the locals. They had these people that lived along the river, the Danakil, who have a long tradition of collecting, when you reach manhood, testicular trophies. You have to go cut off the balls of an enemy member, and then you wear them around your belt as a badge of honor. So all these things were
I'm leaving that one alone.
Yeah.
So many times I'm going to come back to that joke.
I could show you mine.
Yeah.
But,
okay.
So there are all these things, but I did a lot of research over the weeks that led up to our expedition, and I understood the best time of year to go. We got there, we had an extraordinary trip, and it really launched Sobek expeditions. Geographic showed up in the middle of the rainy season, and there were no wildlife. The wildlife leaves the river basin during the rainy season. They had Alan Root, who was a famous geographic photographer, who was on board with them. The river was high, they capsized, Alan Root lost all of his camera gear and all of his film. So the whole thing was a disaster, and it was bad timing. So I showed up at Geographic and I said, "Here are my slides. Do you want to use them?" And they showed me the door. So,
Yeah. Well,
so
it's karma on that one.
Yeah, yeah.
So you get your first one, and then you guys stay in Ethiopia. You run a couple different rivers.
Right.
And I want to come back to the Takazed because so this was '73, and you guys had the plan to run it then. A couple things happened. The country was in a civil war, so that obviously was a big reason you couldn't do it at that time.
Yeah.
But I want to talk about something that also happened because you mentioned that running rivers is not always it's dangerous and things happen. And I want to just touch on also, because you mentioned this in the next clip about Lou.
yeah.
Is that running the Blue Nile, which
Right.
was the longest, one of the longest.
It's the source of the Nile.
Source of the Nile.
Yeah.
And I want to bring this up because one of your original partners was Sobek,
Yep.
who passed away on this expedition.
Yeah.
I just want to see if you would just share with us, like, again, I know we see a lot of this footage and it looks like it's grand, you made it, but I mean, it's real shit. I mean, stuff happens and people die. You got a group of people together,
Right.
96, a lot of the original kind of guys you ran with,
Yep.
to go back to do the Takazed, to the last great first, right? The first expedition of the last time you guys are doing it, but also kind of as a tribute to Lou,
Yes.
to go do this. I want to see if you just share anything about that moment of that, what happened on the Blue Nile and that whole experience.
Well, I mean, it took a long time for me to get over it. And up until that point, I think there was sort of a youthful arrogance in adventure, and this sort of this feeling of immortality that I think that comes with youth. You don't think about risk that much, I think, at that point. At least I didn't. And then I had a series of successes that sort of proved my philosophy. So I never imagined that something could go so terribly wrong. It did a couple of things. One, it had me pull away for a couple of years. I gave up the whole concept of going down wild rivers and went to graduate school and decided to pursue a totally different course. But during that frame, there were friends of mine who would come through a town, and they would stay at my apartment, and they'd be on their way to run a river. And there was always so much excitement and so much enthusiasm and so much passion, as Donnie exhibits, that they would leave, and I'd go, wow, I wonder if I made the right decision. And after a couple of years, I sort of dipped my toes back in the waters, and I recognized that the cliche is true. It's better to be in the ring than to either walk away from it or even watch it. And risk is a part of life. No matter where we go and what we do, there's always inherent risk. And you can be measured and calculating about the risk, but the only way to evolve consciousness and find sort of a certain, I think, richness of being is to take risk. And I will say, as far as Lou goes, I had a sort of a cognitive dissonance after a couple of years. He was 26 years old. And it's just unbelievably tragic to think of something like that being snuffed. But when I met him, he was an insurance salesman. He was a client of mine on the Colorado River, and we bonded and became great friends. And he gave that life up, like you, sold everything and became my partner. And for those few years, he was so alive and so much of a flame. And he laughed so much that a part of me thinks that even though no life should be cut short, he had a moment. He had a really wonderful moment because of the pursuit of adventure. There's a famous short story by Hemingway, The Short Happy Life of Francis Macomber. I don't know if you know it, but it's about sort of a milquetoast from Chicago who goes on safari. And his wife, he brings, goes off with the safari guide, and and makes wild sex with the guy in the tent next door the whole time, and he is so unbelievably intimidated by everything with this huge safari guide that knows everything and stuff, and he finally finds the courage to go out and hunt a lion, and this lion attacks. In the short story, I don't know if anybody's read it, and he finds this moment of courage where he shoots the lion, and then the lion gets him and kills him. But for 1 minute of his life, he is ecstatic, and it makes everything else, go away. It was that one great moment that made his life worthwhile. So, anyway.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing about Lou, and
yeah.
I wanted to share that just because as we're going into this next clip, there's a reference to him, and I wanted to at least put the context together because, again, we look at a lot of the great, triumphs you've had, and I wanted to bring it up because there is a lot of risk with the reward, and it is really important to talk about as well. But I do really acknowledge a lot of the amazing things, but a lot of just the work you have done on that, and thank you for sharing that. So again, 23 years later, you bring a group back together,
yeah.
A lot of the original people,
yeah.
and you make a little movie about it. The full
yeah.
movie, by the way, is on YouTube. The last Wild River Run. The Last Wild River Ride. I think I got one of those two right. Give me a second, I'll figure out. Check out this clip.
This is a story of a group of friends who 20 years ago followed a dream to the highlands of Africa, who sought a treasure of first descents, of discovery, of exploration on the rivers of Ethiopia, who faced death and came back. Bart Henderson, now an Alaska outfitter, survived the whitewater here, but nearly succumbed to hepatitis.
Danger. Danger is something that I don't like to look for. It's something that I don't like to subject myself to.
John Yost, my high school buddy, first river running partner, almost died of malaria.
Rather than thinking about, well, can we really overcome all those handicaps and what are the penalties if things go wrong, we say, this sounds great, let's go do it.
George Fuller, a physician, tropical disease specialist, nearly shot to death in a border dispute. No. Jim Slade, he was nearly done in by schistosomiasis.
When I was in my 20s, I seriously questioned whether I'd live to see the age of 30, but now that I've passed that milestone a while ago, I have greater faith in my judgment, and I think I'll live to a ripe old age.
I'm Richard Bangs. I've been involved with adventure travel most of my life, and my real adventures began here. And at some critical moment, I recognized that I would much rather go forward and try something that hadn't been done before, and perhaps die in this pursuit. And there was a real peace that came with that. There was a sort of liberation with that moment, and I was ready to go forward. I guess this is our covenant, a promise we made to Lou and to each other, to live life as fully as we can, to embrace new places and old friends.
When was the last trip you did with any of us, George? River trip?
A long time.
This is our ritual, talking about old trips, planning new ones.
Burma? Looking for rivers in Burma.
I think Burma would be great.
Yeah. Once they sort out their political problems, we like to wait for
political problems that keep you from the river trip.
Yeah,
we like to
till the week after the problems are solved.
Sobek's specialty, wait for at least a week after the political problems are solved, and then we jump in there.
Until the initial landmine sweep was done.
Yeah.
All right. And at the last grade first. If we congregated again in 23 years, we'd probably be on a canal trip in the south of France or something.
Rich, just like the old days. Yeah.
I would love to.
Awesome. Well, great footage. I mean, that's
Yeah.
really cool stuff.
Huh.
Great,
Archival.
great, yeah, very
Yeah.
archival. You know, I know you guys were just doing it at the time, but it's inspiring to go back and watch it and see for all of us. And I actually was lucky enough I got to have coffee with you and Bart, and then I met Slade on the street.
Right, right.
use Slade and Bart just in Venice randomly.
Yeah.
Which I'd been watching all this footage for like days, putting it together, and then I randomly ran into three of them on the street, and I was like such a little fanboy, like, oh my god, like, you guys, look, Slade, you lived way past 30. Like, it's quite amazing.
Yeah.
Good stuff. I want to show this picture. Anybody guess who Richard is?
It's not easy.
The funniest thing about this video, or this picture I should say, is this looks like it could almost be Venice or like Burning Man now, right? It could be. I mean, come on, this is all still in stuff. I mean, that's funny. So, guesses on Richard Bangs?
Right? All right.
Richard Bangs.
Yeah.
Right? Buffed up a little bit.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, because you guys talk about you have your crocodile handshake. Were any of the boats ever attacked by crocodiles?
Oh, many.
How many were attacked?
Many boats have been bitten by crocodiles and hippos too.
And hippos.
Yeah.
And so the old boats, they were all kind of deflated.
Right.
And you guys did what with those at that point?
You're talking about Djibouti.
Yeah.
So back then, in order for us to bring our rafts into Ethiopia, we had to put up a bond, and we would get the bond back once we took the rafts out. So, and the bond was based on the retail version of a new boat, so it was quite expensive. And they would stamp the passport on the way out, and then give us our money back. So, as we had boats bitten by crocodiles, they were completely annihilated. We didn't want to pay for the shipping back to the States, and we discovered that for $5 we could put them on the train to Djibouti, which is a small country on the Red Sea. The border is Ethiopia. So we made up a name, Pierre Dupont, I remember that, and we put all the rafts on and paid the $5 each, got our passports stamped and got our bond back, and they all went off to Djibouti. And then last year you went to Djibouti. Yeah, you got a picture of it or something?
Well, I have this picture. Explain what this is, because the setups of this.
Oh yeah, so last year I went to Djibouti for the first time, and decided to go to the train station, and then in the back of the train station is now closed, it's all shuttered up, but in the back of the train station there were a series of huts that were made out of our rafting material. So they were put to good use after all.
So you found them.
Yeah.
So travels for you. I know you have a trip coming up to Oman, right?
Yep.
And a lot of stuff through SOBAC. And we do want to mention that it's the 50th anniversary coming up in 2019, which is a pretty big deal. And I do call the SOBAC the original adventure company, because you truly are. There's a lot of other brands that have come around since and do a lot of good work, but you guys really are, a lot of the original adventure companies. So what does travel mean to you?
Travel with meaning. I guess I would say I think freedom was a very good word for it, but I think it's also understanding. I think the world is infinitely complex. It's very easy to sort of interpret the world from what we see around us and make judgments and have a behavior that's reactive to what we think are things that are different or other. And I think travel moves a few steps closer to this impossible goal of understanding the interconnectedness of all things. But it's a good thing, because the more you sort of connect those dots, I think the more tolerant, understanding, appreciative, wiser. I think there's an evolution of consciousness that goes on, and I think you and the planet and the other people all become richer for it. So it's a very good thing.